The call came on a Tuesday evening in November, just as the first frost was settling on my windows. My daughter-in-law's voice sounded unusually sweet through the phone. Almost honey dripped in a way that should have been my first warning. "We'd love to have you for Thanksgiving this year," she said, and I could hear my son agreeing in the background. After 3 years of strained conversations and missed holidays, my heart leaped at what felt like an olive branch. I spent the entire week preparing. I baked 2 pumpkin pies from scratch, the same recipe my mother taught me 50 years ago. The kitchen filled with cinnamon and nutmeg, scents that reminded me of better times when family meant something sacred. I wrapped small gifts for each grandchild, nothing expensive, but chosen with care from my limited budget. Thursday morning arrived crisp and golden. I stood at my mirror adjusting the collar of my best dress shirt, the one I'd worn to church for decades. My hands shook slightly as I smoothed down my graying hair. Hope felt dangerous at my age, but I couldn't help myself. When I knocked on the front door of what had once been my family home, my daughter-in-law answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you're here," she said, as if my arrival was somehow unexpected. Behind her I could see the warm glow of the dining room, hear the chatter of voices I recognized but hadn't heard in so long. The moment I crossed the threshold, something shifted in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. The laughter that had been flowing freely just seconds before seemed to catch in everyone's throats. My son looked up from carving the turkey, his knife pausing mid-slice, and offered me a nod that felt more like acknowledgement than welcome. The dining room looked magnificent. Candles flickered on the mahogany table I'd polished countless times over the years, casting dancing shadows on walls I'd painted myself. Every seat was occupied by family members who avoided my gaze, suddenly fascinated by their wine glasses and napkins. "Dad, glad you could make it," my son said, but his voice carried the weight of obligation rather than joy. My daughter-in-law bustled around the table, her movements sharp and purposeful as she guided me to a corner where a lone folding chair sat askew from the main gathering. "Sorry about the seating," she said with practiced regret. "We weren't quite sure you were coming, but I had confirmed twice. Once when I accepted the invitation, and again yesterday when I'd asked what time to arrive." I settled into the uncomfortable metal chair, my pies and gifts feeling suddenly foolish in my lap. The conversations resumed around me, flowing over and past me like water around a stone. I became invisible in my own former dining room, watching my family celebrate Thanksgiving as if I were merely a tolerated stranger. The serving began with great ceremony. My daughter-in-law moved around the table with practiced grace, loading plates with golden turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, and vibrant cranberry sauce. Each family member received generous portions, their plates overflowing with the abundance of the holiday feast. I watched plate after plate leave the kitchen, each one a masterpiece of Thanksgiving tradition. The children giggled as their portions were adjusted to their appetites. My son's siblings received seconds before they'd even asked. Even distant relatives I barely recognized were treated like honored guests. When my daughter-in-law finally approached my corner, the serving dishes looked noticeably depleted. She scraped together what remained, a few pieces of dark meat from the turkey's backbone, a small spoonful of stuffing that had grown cold, and some vegetables that had lost their vibrant color. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "This is all that's left. I hope you don't mind." She placed the meager portion before me with the same care one might show when feeding scraps to a stray dog. My hands trembled as I picked up my fork, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "Thank you," I whispered, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Around me, my family continued their feast, seemingly oblivious to the deliberate cruelty that had just unfolded. The food on my plate looked like the remnants of a meal already finished, not the beginning of one meant to celebrate gratitude and family bonds. As the meal progressed, the wine flowed more freely, and with it came the loosened tongues of my ungrateful family. I sat in my corner, quietly picking at my meager portion, when I began to catch fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. "Can you believe he still drives that old car?" my daughter-in-law whispered to her sister, just loud enough for me to hear. "I mean, it's practically falling apart." My son leaned in, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that only comes with liquid courage. "He should have sold that big house years ago, living alone in all that space, barely able to afford the heating bills. The table erupted in knowing laughter that felt like knives against my skin. "Remember when he asked us to help with groceries last month?" someone added. I felt so embarrassed for him. More laughter followed, each chuckle another nail in the coffin of my dignity. I continued eating mechanically, each bite harder to swallow than the last. These were my children, the ones I'd sacrificed everything for. I'd worked double shifts to pay for their education, skipped meals so they could have the latest clothes, and given up my own dreams so theirs could flourish. The house they sat in, mocking my financial struggles, was still legally mine. The roof over their heads, the walls that sheltered their laughter, the very chairs they sat in, all mine. They had no idea how precarious their comfortable little world really was. The weight of their mockery became unbearable. I excused myself quietly, mumbling something about needing fresh air, though no one seemed to notice or care about my departure. The cold November air hit my face like a slap, but it was a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. I stood on the front porch of my own home, looking out at the neighborhood I'd lived in for over 30 years. Every tree in the yard had been planted by my hands. Every flower bed had been carefully tended through seasons of growth and dormancy. This house held the echoes of children's laughter, birthday parties, and Christmas mornings when magic still existed. My breathing steadied in the crisp air, and for the first time all evening, my hands stopped shaking. Through the dining room window, I could see my family continuing their celebration, their faces animated with wine and contentment. They looked so comfortable, so entitled, so completely unaware of the foundation their security rested upon. I pulled out my phone with fingers that no longer trembled, scrolling through my digital files until I found what I was looking for. The house deed, clear and legal, with my name prominently displayed as the sole owner. I'd never transferred the title, despite years of pressure to do so. At the time, I'd kept it as security for my old age. Now, it felt like destiny. Standing alone on that porch, I stared at the official document glowing on my phone screen. The property deed, dated 15 years ago, showed my name in bold black letters. Not my son's name, not my daughter-in-law's name, mine. They'd been living in my house, raising their children under my roof, building their comfortable life on my generosity, and they'd forgotten the most important detail of all. I remembered the day I'd bought this house, scraping together every penny for the down payment while working 2 jobs. I'd painted every room myself, installed the fixtures with my own hands, and made countless repairs over the years. This wasn't just a house. It was the physical manifestation of my life's work. The mortgage had been paid off 8 years ago, a moment of pride I'd celebrated alone because my family had been too busy to acknowledge the achievement. Since then, the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance costs, all of it had come from my modest retirement income. They'd never asked about the finances, never offered to help, never shown the slightest curiosity about how their comfortable lifestyle was maintained. My son had married his wife in the backyard of this house. My grandchildren had taken their first steps on these floors. Every holiday, every celebration, every important moment of their lives had happened within these walls that I owned, maintained, and protected. And in return, they'd given me table scraps in mockery. The irony was almost poetic. They thought I was the weak one, the dependent one, the burden to be tolerated and patronized. They had no idea that with a single phone call, I could change everything. I composed myself and returned to the dining room, slipping back into my folding chair with a serenity that surprised even me. The conversation barely paused at my return. They were discussing their upcoming winter vacation to Florida, debating between beachfront hotels and rental condos as if money were no object. "I think we should go with the bigger place," my daughter-in-law was saying. "The kids need room to spread out, and we deserve a little luxury after working so hard all year." I found myself smiling, not the bitter grimace I'd worn earlier, but a genuine expression of amusement. "I'm so glad you all feel at home here," I said quietly, my words carrying a weight that no one at the table could possibly understand. My son glanced at me with mild surprise. "Of course we do, Dad. This is our home." "Yes," I agreed, still smiling. "It certainly is comfortable." I paused, letting the moment stretch. "If you'll excuse me, I need to make a quick phone call. Business matter that can't wait, even on Thanksgiving." I stepped into the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd taught my children to cook, where I'd nursed them through childhood illnesses, where I'd celebrated their successes and comforted their disappointments. My attorney's emergency number was already programmed into my phone. 24-hour service had cost me extra, but tonight it would prove worth every penny. "Harold, this is about the property we discussed," I said quietly into the phone. "I need you to proceed with the eviction notice." "Yes, I'm certain. First thing tomorrow morning." Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the universe itself was preparing for the storm about to break. I had spent the night in a hotel, unable to bear another moment in that house, with people who had shown me such calculated disrespect. My sleep had been surprisingly peaceful, the sleep of someone who had finally decided to act rather than endure. I returned to the house around 10 o'clock, letting myself in with my key. My house, my key, my right. The family was scattered around the living room in various states of post-holiday laziness. My grandchildren were playing with their toys, my son was reading the newspaper, and my daughter-in-law was scrolling through her phone, probably planning that Florida vacation. The doorbell rang at exactly 10:30. My daughter-in-law answered it with the casual confidence of someone who believed herself to be the lady of the house. The courier was professional and efficient, requesting a signature for certified documents. She signed without reading, assuming it was probably some promotional material or neighborhood notice. It wasn't until she opened the envelope that her face began to change. The color drained from her cheeks as she read the header. "Notice to quit and demand for possession of premises." Her hands started shaking as the legal language made its meaning clear. Stepped forward from where I'd been quietly, observing from the kitchen doorway, my coffee mug steady in my hands. "You forgot something important," I said, my voice calm and measured. "You forgot who actually owns this house." The papers fell from her trembling fingers, scattering across the coffee table like fallen leaves. The silence that followed was deafening. My son looked up from his newspaper, confusion clouding his features as he tried to process what was happening. My daughter-in-law's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish gasping for air. "What is this?" my son finally managed, reaching for the papers with hands that had suddenly become unsteady. "It's exactly what it says," I replied, setting down my coffee mug with deliberate care. "A 30-day notice to vacate the premises. This house belongs to me. It has always belonged to me. I never transferred the deed, despite your assumptions." The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and chaotic. My daughter-in-law began crying, great heaving sobs that would have moved me to sympathy just 24 hours earlier. My son's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. "You can't do this," he shouted. "This is our home! Our children live here." "Your children," I said quietly, "live in my house. Have always lived in my house. You've been guests here, guests who forgot their manners and disrespected their host." I explained it all then, calmly and methodically, how I'd paid every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every insurance premium, how I'd maintained the house, repaired the roof, updated the plumbing, all while they lived rent-free and treated me like a burden. "Family means respect," I concluded. "And yesterday you served me scraps while living off my generosity. You mocked my struggles while benefiting from my sacrifices. That ends today." 3 weeks later, I sat in my new apartment, a cozy 2-bedroom place across town with a view of the park where I'd taken my children to play decades ago. The space was smaller but perfectly sized for my needs, and more importantly, it was paid for with the proceeds from finally selling the house that had become a source of pain rather than joy. My Thanksgiving dinner was simple but complete: a small turkey breast, perfectly seasoned stuffing, roasted vegetables, and a slice of pumpkin pie from the bakery down the street. No one had to scrape together leftovers for me. No one whispered cruel jokes about my circumstances. No one treated me like an unwelcome stranger. The silence wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt the dignity that comes from being valued, even if I had to value myself. My phone had rung several times over the past weeks. My son's voice on the voicemail had evolved from anger to bargaining to something approaching remorse. They'd found a small apartment, he said. The children were adjusting. Maybe we could talk, maybe we could. But this time, the conversation would happen on equal terms, between people who understood that respect flows both ways in a family. I'd taught them the hardest lesson of their lives, that kindness taken for granted eventually becomes kindness withdrawn. I raised my water glass in a quiet toast to the empty apartment, to the peace I'd found, and to the truth that sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching people the consequences of their choices. This Thanksgiving, I was finally, genuinely grateful. Grateful for the strength to demand better, and grateful for the wisdom that comes from knowing your own worth. Outside my window, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the world in pristine white like a fresh start.